All right, so welcome to our first ever panel format interview. I'm Brooks Bentz for the National Railroad Hall of Fame, and today we come to you from the 19th floor of UP's headquarters in Omaha, Nebraska, and we're pleased to have three of the key members of UP's merger team, Paul Connolly, Mike Hemmer, and John Riebensdorf, with us to discuss the creation and evolution of the merger team. Our goal is to capsulize that story of the activities and the analytics that brought UP to where they are today. So let us start with some introductions. We'll start with John Riebensdorf here to my left, and each of them will give a bit of background on their history, personal history, how they got where they got, and their role on the merger team. So John, over to you.
I am a third generation railroader. My family was in Lincoln, Nebraska, worked for the Burlington. I started with the Burlington when I was 17 years old, my first day out of high school. I worked as a carman helper, and after 2 weeks, I was set up as a car inspector. 4 days later, I got laid off. They told me I had a bad back, and they were laying off, or failing, I should say, over 50% of the employees that they hired. So I got caught in that dragnet. So I went across town and got a job on the Rock Island as a track laborer, section gang. And I continued to work for the Rock Island while I was attending the University of Nebraska, where I got a degree in civil engineering. Then I went on for an MBA, and again, I continued to work for the Rock Island. I came to Union Pacific Corporation in 1968. One of my professors in graduate school was consulting to the Union Pacific Corporation. So I said I'd be interested in looking at potential job offers at UP. So he said, okay, let me see what I can do. Long story short, I was hired by the chairman of the corporation, Frank Barnett, at that time, sight unseen. I never talked to him, never wrote anything to him. They hired me and had me work in the consultant's office in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The consultant was working for Union Pacific, and I worked on the UP project. I came out to Omaha in 1971 when John Kennefick became president of the railroad. I had gotten to know Kennefick when I was working in Cambridge. I started in Omaha as manager of budget research, and basically what that job entailed was implementing a responsibility accounting system over the UP railroad at that time. I then moved up through succeeding positions in finance, strategic planning, and the operating department. My last position was vice president, network planning and operations, and I retired from that position in 2012 after 44 years with the Union Pacific and 51 years in the industry.
And I think it was interesting that one of your advisors in graduate school was Paul Charrington. Maybe you would spend a moment to just talk about him, because he was a leading light in the business.
Yeah, Paul Charrington was, in the late 60s, early 70s, was probably one of the foremost transportation experts in the country. He was my first-year advisor at Harvard. He later became Deputy Secretary, Undersecretary of Transportation under John Volpe, who was a former Massachusetts governor.
Right.
And I worked for Paul for a while when I was consulting. But yeah, that was a real experience. He was a very knowledgeable man. Witness the fact that he was brought into DOT.
Yeah, and he later went on, I didn't have a direct connection with him, but he later went on to run the Boston and Maine.
Correct.
And when he passed away, Alan Dustin took over, who was the man who ran it when I was there. So, yeah, a very interesting and accomplished individual. Okay, Paul?
Well, talking about generational railroaders, I'm a first generation railroader. However, there may be more. My middle son, Todd, is currently a conductor on the Union Pacific out in Colorado on the Craig Branch. And my oldest son began his business career as a trainmaster on CSX. He later moved on to a different job with 3M. But I grew up in the New York metropolitan area. We did live in Westchester until all the kids left home, and then my parents moved back to Manhattan. But I graduated from Hamilton College in 1968. And for history buffs, that was the time of the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, and I enlisted in the Navy. And I served as a Combat Information Center officer on 2 destroyers. And during my time in the Navy, I decided that I wanted to be a lawyer, and my ships were at sea all the time, and so I had the ship designated as a test center, and I was the only one who showed up in the middle of the Atlantic to take the LSAT. I went to Creighton University Law, and I ended up at Union Pacific, which was a good place to be for me. I had some interesting assignments early in my career, but one of the most interesting was one day when the then Vice President of Law, and a guy who used to get a lot of credit for the merger team, in fact, if not a lot, all of it, is a guy named Barry Schaefer. And Barry hired me, and but after I'd been there for a couple of years, he came into my office one day and he said, I want you to do some research on the legal requirements to buy a railroad. I'm like, whoa. And he said, it's the Western Pacific. And so I did that, and after about 3 days, I got summoned up to the C-suite on the then 12th floor, and they're talking about buying the Missouri Pacific, and I'd been sworn to secrecy, and I thought, this is the height of secrecy. They told me the wrong railroad, when in fact, we were buying both of them. So after that, it was pretty much a full-time job for me for the next 2 years. So that's kind of my background there.
And you stayed quite a while.
Well, yeah, I did. I mean, I stayed through all the rest of our mergers. When there were no more railroads to buy, I moved on.
Mike?
I'm Mike Hemmer. I was born in 1949 in Oklahoma. One of the places we lived was right next to the Frisco Railroad main line. I fell in love with trains, and by 3, I was completely hooked. From 1967 to 1975, I both went to school, as John did, and worked on railroads. I had positions for the Rock Island, the Santa Fe, and the Southern Pacific. They were all union jobs outdoors in railroad freight yards. During that period, I earned an undergraduate degree from Stanford and a law degree from UC Berkeley. In '76, I moved back to Washington, D.C., got a job with one of the best law firms in the United States, a place called Covington & Burling. They immediately put me to work, helping to clean up the last vestiges of the Penn Central merger. I also worked on a $9 billion case for Union Pacific Corporation to try to protect the railroad's mineral rights from lawsuits. In 1980, Barry Schaefer and Paul hired Covington & Burling to work on the UP-MP-WP case that Paul was talking about. I immediately jumped on that project and worked on every UP merger project from then through 2000. In 2002, I moved out here to be Senior Vice President of Law and General Counsel for UP for a decade.
Very good. So that's our panel for today. I just want to take a minute and set the scene at the beginning of all of this, which was in 1972. For those of you who may remember, or those of you who weren't around, Nixon was president. Watergate was underway, although we didn't all know it at the time. Vietnam was still going on. Julie King, our executive director, puts together a very comprehensive timeline of events to help track the way events unfolded, and pointed out that the first handheld calculator was brought to fore by HP at that time, and I was recalling yesterday that at that particular time I was a trainee on the Norfolk and Western and out with a roadmaster one day, and he showed me his handheld calculator, which was known as the Bomar Brain, which would add, subtract, multiply, and divide, and he paid something like $500 for it, which they later on were giving away free with a fill-up at gas stations. So times had changed pretty dramatically. The economy was doing really well. Unemployment was only about 5%. The growth rate was a little over 6%. Interestingly, in the railroad business, there were over 100 Class 1 railroads. My recollection was it was 113 at that time. The Penn Central bankruptcy had occurred a couple of years before, and that had still, the effects of that were reverberating through the industry. Also, before that, 1967, the Postal Service had canceled the railway mail contracts for all the railway mail that was being hauled. And that was the revenue producer that made operating passenger trains by the railroads acceptable. And the bloodbath that occurred after that was removed ultimately led to the formation of Amtrak in 1971. But deregulation was still almost a decade away. So in 1980, with the passage of the Staggers Act, my reading skills are better than my memorizing skills, so I just want to take a moment and talk a little bit about Union Pacific's situation then. Things were good. Transportation revenues were up to $779 million, up 11% from 1971. UP hit an all-time high with greater than 51 billion ton miles of revenue freight. John Kennefick had taken the helm in 1971. That's a position he held until 1983, and he was a transformational character in the history of the UP, and we'll get into that in detail with these gentlemen shortly. But he had come from the East, from the New York Central, and had a more, I think, enlightened attitude. The railroads were typically fairly militaristic in their approach to running the business, and he was trying to get rid of the vice-like grip of this authoritarian system and open it up to the going away from "we've always done it this way" attitude. And he also was instrumental in hiring more women and minorities in the workplace. And I think instructively, he was the genesis behind the drive to merge and wanted to develop in-house the capabilities to do the analytics and the strategy behind merging rather than outsourcing that. So he relied on people like the folks here in this room to do that. And interestingly, his influence didn't end when he retired. He retained an office in the UP headquarters building until he died, which was highly unusual at the time. And he was relied on by the leadership for continuing advice as the company evolved. So that's the background that we're going to go into this with. I want to dive in and talk first about the origins of the merger team, and I'm going to turn to John here and let him discuss how that occurred and why it occurred and what activities and analytics were being done.
Brooks, I think we talked about the backgrounds of the three of us that are here. There are three other people that are not here that I think we need to recognize. One of them, and Mike will address this individual, has since passed away. The other two I'll speak to are Dale Solzman and Dick Peterson. Dale was a graduate of the University of Illinois, grew up in Illinois, went to work for the Missouri Pacific upon graduation, and was in the it was called industrial engineering on the Missouri Pacific, but what it really was Downing Jenks's planning and analytical office. So Dale had a lot of good exposure to the Missouri Pacific and specifically to some of the senior officers like Downing Jenks. Dale came out to Union Pacific in 1973, I believe it was, and it came into the industrial engineering group. But in 1975, and we'll get into this in more detail, he became a part of what became known as the merger team. The other person is Dick Peterson. Dick is a native of Annandale, Minnesota, which is on the Sioux line, just west of the Twin Cities. Dick went to the University of Minnesota, got a civil engineering degree at the University of Minnesota, and came to Union Pacific in 1970 in the marketing department. Dick was manager of service planning in our marketing organization and was responsible for some of the more innovative service products that we put out in the marketplace. Just one of them, to give you an idea, back in the mid-'70s, we established expedited perishable service from California to the New York market called Fresh from the West. That was Dick's creation. And it was very successful. Unfortunately, the business got poached away by non-regulated truckers, so it was hard to maintain it, but that service existed for at least 15 years before we started consolidating it with other trains. So those two people were very critical, and I guess both of them, I'd have to say, had an encyclopedic knowledge of the U.S. railroad network. Somebody could ask them, what about a railroad in someplace in Pennsylvania? And they would know about it. And it was this knowledge that served the merger team very well, particularly as we went head-to-head with some of the opponents in the other mergers. So, Mike, you want to talk about Arvid?
Yes, the third gentleman who would be here if he had not passed away very young was named Arvid Roach. Arvid was one of the people who was on the UP-MPWP team starting in 1980. He knew nothing about railroads and had no particular interest in them. That changed over time. Arvid was brilliant, and he fell in love with railroading as well. He was a kind of Renaissance guy, lots of interest, had one of the best collections of railroad books in the world in his home. But as a railroad lawyer, he came to be Union Pacific's real outside legal counsel.
And he was with Covington and Burling.
He was with Covington and Burling, that's right. And so he played a leading role in all of the railroad merger cases after UP-MPWP. I have no hesitation in saying that Arvid was the finest railroad merger lawyer in the nation during that entire era, and I think every opponent lawyer in Washington would agree.
I would just add one thing to that. Arvid is one of the few people that has had a siding named after him on the Union Pacific. And appropriately, it is on what we call the Golden State Line. And I guess it's about 40 miles from Tucumcari, New Mexico. Most people probably haven't heard about Tucumcari, but anyway, that is very rare for the company to do that. And I think it shows the respect that all of us had for Arvid Roach.
What really showed the respect was not just naming a siding for him in a remote part of New Mexico, but that the Union Pacific senior management, to a man and woman, went to that siding and held a memorial service for him and invited all of us who had worked with him. It was very touching.
Impressive.
Let me just make one other comment about the merger team itself. There's 6 of us that should be here, the 2, Dick and Dale, that I talked about, and Arvid. We're what I would call the core team. We are the people that were with this group for anywhere from 30 to 40 years through every merger that we have gone through. But there were other people involved. We had sat down in preparation for this and started trying to put a list together of who was all involved on the merger team. It is well over 100 people, probably closer to 200 people that came in and out and helped us as we were either evaluating mergers or pursuing the merger in front of the regulatory authorities. And also, I want to recognize the railroads that we merged with, the people that came from other railroads. They were totally committed to what we were trying to do in terms of pushing a merger through the ICC or the STB. Everybody was on board. It's one of the most amazing things I've ever seen.
There's one more component of the merger group. Union Pacific had a Washington, D.C. government affairs office. They were the premier government affairs operation in the railroad industry and perhaps most other industries. They played key roles in generating support for the mergers and in blunting political opposition that might have overridden them. Very effective.
Critical, yeah. Paul, maybe it's a good time to comment on the plate that we have on the table in front of us.
Yeah, well, when we think about how many people were really involved in the mergers, one of the things that I think made us effective is that we were dealing with merger partners whose cultures were completely different. Maybe not completely, because we were all railroaders, but they were different. And the way that came together was we had total support from senior management. If we needed something, we got it. And the senior management, and that then moved down through the department heads to almost everybody, knew that this was job one and we were going to get it done. So when John commented about when we sat back and started thinking about how many people were involved in this, I thought about how we recognized people who were involved. And one of the things that we did for every one of our deals was we had a commemorative plate put together, and it was either porcelain or it was pewter. And we put on them, it was how many of them were done. So in the earlier mergers, I think the UP-MA merger, our plate had 350 distributed. And now the plate that's here on the table was for the UP-SP merger. And the reason I picked that one is twofold. One, it shows all the constituent railroads that we ended up merging with. But two, on the back, we made 750 of those. And that'll just show you how many people were involved in this effort.
So I want to back up to when you arrive at the UP. What happened? What transpired that, someday you get a call and say, I want help on creating merger intelligence and analytics capability inside the company? How did that evolve?
The genesis of what became known as the merger team was something called Project Manhattan, which was initiated in 1972 by Barry Schaefer when he came to the railroad from the corporation as vice president of law. Barry started asking the questions as he looked at the railroad environment, which you have described, Penn Central bankruptcy, the Midwestern railroads, some of them were starting to teeter on the brink of bankruptcy at the time. And he was asking the question, where does UP fit into all of this? And how are we preparing to survive in this type of environment? He talked to someone by the name of John Jorgensen, who headed up what UP called Management Information Systems. Now it's generally referred to as information technology. And John Jorgensen knew me from when he was sent back to a management development program at Harvard. I met him, and he was somewhat instrumental in my ultimately coming to the railroad in 1971. But John suggested to Barry that he talk to me, which Barry did. And Barry asked me to develop a plan for how we would evaluate where we should be positioned in the railroad industry. I did that, and that's probably the major work product that came out of Project Manhattan. And when when this gelled was, and we can get into this in more detail later, but what was known as Project XYZ in 1975. That's when Dick and Dale came into it. I was brought into it also. And that was really when we got started in terms of working as a team. And that core group stayed together, as I previously indicated, for basically the next 30 years. Brooks, let me make one other comment about Project Manhattan before we get off of it. That is, why was it called Manhattan? As everybody probably knows, Project Manhattan was the name of the atomic bomb development in the Second World War. And Barry had a sense of humor. So he named this Project Manhattan, and it really was appropriate because if Union Pacific would have pursued anything, it would have opened up. It would have been like a big bomb. And the Rock Island merger, which was ongoing at that time, is a good example. When Union Pacific applied to merge with the Rock Island, it brought everybody out of the woodwork, mostly in opposition. So Barry recognized that, given the question he's asking, that he's probably going to do the same thing. So that's how Manhattan got.
Is it so? In a lot of railroads, there was a departmental function, operations planning or strategic planning or something. You didn't have a formal department. You had a team. Did you have an official leader? How was it structured?
There was not a leader per se of the merger team. It usually depended on what we were doing, and in terms of two primary products of the merger team. One was what I would call the strategic evaluation of who should we be looking at in terms of mergers. And that usually would be headed by myself because I headed up a group by 1975 that was called Planning and Analysis. And Kennebec was one of the people that was instrumental in the establishment of that group because, as you had previously indicated, prior to that time when we did merger studies, it was contracted out. Like in the Rock Island merger, it was a company by the name of Wire Dick. And a lot of the legal work was also contracted out. As you had indicated, Kennebec wanted to bring a lot of that in-house, which he did through the establishment of the P&A organization. The other product of the merger team, though, was once we had identified someone and negotiated a merger agreement, we had the whole regulatory process that we had to work our way through. That was usually headed by the law department. Barry Schaefer, or as Barry would phase out of it, Paul. Paul became, in later mergers, was the leader of getting the regulatory approvals done.
Maybe we could take a moment and just talk about John Kennebec in a little bit more detail for the benefit of those who maybe know the name but don't know the man. And maybe I could get the views of each of you on him.
John Kennebec was, in my estimation, was one of the most brilliant railroaders that came out of the last half of the 20th century. He was very knowledgeable about the industry. We used to always say, he knows more about your job than you do. And that led to the realization, some people had to learn this lesson the hard way, that you never tried to bluff your way through something with him if you didn't really know what it was, because that could lead to disaster.
Unfortunate consequences.
But he was direct. He kept good control of what was going on within the company. Again, this goes back to he knew more than a lot of people that reported directly to him.
And he had come up through the New York Central organization with Hal Perlman and Mike Flannery.
Yes. The other thing I would say about John Kennefic, in my estimation, he was a real leader. He gave people what the resources they needed to get the job done, and usually he stayed out of the way. And that I know that from my experience, where he gave me enough rope, I guess you could say, that I could hang myself. Fortunately, I didn't do it.
And he was accessible.
Pardon?
He was accessible.
He was very accessible, and that was one of the things that I think made the merger team effective. Once we got through the MPWP, you could call him directly on an issue, and he'd always talk to you, but he was always caution you that make sure your boss knows about this. Just whenever you talk to me, make sure your boss knows about it. So there was never anything under the table. There was no hidden agenda. He was right out there up front with you.
And Paul, last night you were telling an interesting story about how to get access to him, sort of.
I completely agree with John. Of all the presidents that I worked for at Union Pacific, Kennefic was kind of my favorite. And we were working, all of us were working 24/7 on these mergers. And we used to fly to Washington on the company jet on Sunday afternoon, and we would fly back to Omaha on Friday afternoon. We'd go to the office, and sometimes I'd be in the office both days until I got on a jet flying back to Washington. One day, I'm sitting there on a Sunday morning, and Kennefic walks into my office and sits down and talks to me about what we're doing and expresses appreciation for the time that we're putting in. And I thought, wow, that's impressive. John talks about his sense of humor, and he really had one. And I'll tell you a personal story about it. My oldest son, who was not old at the time, but we lived in a neighborhood pretty close to Kennefic. And one day I get to work, and Schaefer calls me up, and he says, "Have you heard from Kennefic this morning?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, you're gonna." And so I get a phone call from Kennefic. I answer the phone. "Paul Connolly, this is..." And he says, "This is old man Kennefic." And the reason he was doing that is my son went to sell him a magazine subscription for the school. And when he walked in, he looks at Kennefic and he goes, "Do you know my dad? He works for Union Pacific." Kennefic says, "Well, yes, I do." And Paul, my son Paul, says to him, "Are you Mr. Kennefic's father?" and Kennefic says to me, Mr. Kennefic's father really likes that story, but his mother hates it." Sammy. So, I mean, that was kind of typical of, he could be really human and down to earth. But as John pointed out, you did not go into him unless you knew what you were talking about. And if you didn't know, you should tell him you didn't know.
I'll give you one more quick story about his accessibility. Everybody knew that at 6 a.m. he was at Bishop's cafeteria having breakfast. But I was told, at least, that everybody also knew he would entertain anyone at his table to talk. Dispatchers, trainmen. I decided I would go talk to him at 6 a.m. one morning about some merger question involving operations. He was quite happy to have me come and talk to him, and gave me his advice. Phenomenal. That I wasn't even an employee, but he would allow that to happen.
But his work habits were start early, work late, and work oftentimes, at least, if not through the weekend, at least through parts of the weekend, right?
He came in the office 7 days a week. And even, as you pointed out, in retirement, he was the only person that I'm aware of that's ever had an office in the building after they retired. And he came in 7 days a week. Interesting story here, if I may digress. After he retired, one Sunday morning, And Kennebec always wore a suit and tie. You
Even
very
on the
rarely.
weekends.
Pardon?
Even on the weekends.
Yeah. And this, what happened, this is on week, one Sunday morning after he retired, he's walking around the house, just fidgeting around, and his wife said, "John, what are you going to do with yourself now?" And he said, "Ah, hell, I might as well go to Mass." So he went off to church. But, I mean, he was so into the railroad and into the company. It was a 7-day focus for him. And it wasn't so much that he demanded others come in 7 days a week. But if you had something you wanted to talk with him about, a lot of times the best time to talk to him was on the weekend.
Less formal, even
Yeah.
though he was in a suit and tie.
Yeah, like Paul said, he would, a lot of times he'd just wander down to my office, and if he wanted something or if he just wanted to talk about what's going on.
There's a number of unique aspects to the merger team, one of which is the relationship with outside counsel, Covington and Burling. And I think there were a couple of points that you made last night about how knowledgeable the law firm got about the railroad and the railroad business as opposed to some other firms that were supporting other carriers. And I think it'd be instructive if both of you would comment on how that relationship evolved, how it began, how it evolved, because they weren't the in-house counsel at one point, right? There was another firm that was there. And I think that's an interesting story about how that evolved and where it stands today.
Well, as I said, Barry and Paul came to hire Covington and Burling. We heard the story. I don't know if it's true that we were their fifth choice, but the other law firms that knew more about railroads were already engaged in some way. Barry immediately set about educating us about Union Pacific. I mean, a couple of us knew something about railroads, but we didn't really know Union Pacific. And Barry would teach us from 8 in the morning until 10:30 at night. I remember I love railroads, and I was exhausted by all this information. He took us on a train trip, an inspection train trip out to North Platte, down to Kansas City, over to St. Louis. And he really made sure that we understood the strategy that he had in mind, and that we understood at least the basics of rail operation. And then what happened over coming years, from my perspective, Paul, is that UP integrated us into this merger team. That was a strategic advantage for us as lawyers because we could always reach people who knew the answers to our questions. We were involved in helping to develop those answers. But we were significantly better informed than I think many of the other outside counsel who were really being treated more as contractors, as John said.
Yeah, at some points, Arvid didn't have an official office in the law department, but he had an unofficial office in the law department. I mean, he would be in one of our conference rooms and have all his stuff in there, and that was his room.
And the same thing with Mike.
It's true.
When particularly I remember on the Southern Pacific merger, that you basically were living out here.
Right. And we wanted to be responsible about this, but Paul, whom Arvid always described as the best client in the world, would allow us to just hop on a plane and go to Omaha and talk to who we needed to about whatever we needed to. I mean, we didn't abuse that privilege, but it was immensely valuable to have that contact.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you talk about the integration of them into the law department, yeah, they didn't need to call me up and say, hey, can we go talk to Jerry Davis, or can we talk to Dick, or can we? No, they could just do that.
That's the high vote of confidence and teamwork spirit that you don't see oftentimes between clients.
It also enabled us. We were able to serve the company better than we could have otherwise.
Yeah. And the relationship goes on to this day, correct?
Yeah.
That's fairly amazing in these days, so impressive. So the merger approval process, it's more convoluted today, and we'll get into that, but describe how it evolved in those times. What process did you go through? I think what you were describing yesterday was a different approach than some carriers had taken to getting mergers approved, and that was instrumental, I think, in helping you in the cause.
Well, I can maybe start with that, because what we were looking at is putting together the merger application that was going to get filed with initially the Interstate Commerce Commission. And we put together basically a team to do that, which was Covington, John's outfit, operating department. We had every department involved in it. And we actually hired a guy his name was Stan Pierce. He was a retired Air Force lieutenant colonel, and we made him the merger administrative officer. And his job was to, deal with printing, delivering the application, the UP-MOP WP application. We actually Mike described it, the boxes were this big. They were big. And we put them all in a company jet, and Stan flew them to Washington and got them filed. And we had an office in Washington for the merger people. We had pretty much unfettered use of the company jet if we needed it. Stan would arrange, we had a van that took people back and forth between the ICC and our office during the hearings. So we had a big organization to support this. But maybe even more significant is that we had a weekly meeting with the department heads at UP. And we kept them informed. And that's why I think it was easier to get what we needed from the people that reported to them. I will never forget, one of the things we were working on was we wanted shippers support. And I went to Dick Hotzinger, who was at the time vice president of sales. And I explained to him what we needed, and that we wanted statements from shippers in support of the merger. And he just looked at me and goes, "How many do you want?" So he put his whole organization to work getting those statements. And it would go that way with everything. Mike, you could talk about the operating plan, because Mike did all the operating, work, and Dick, Arvin did the competitive stuff. But you want to talk a little bit about that?
I remember the first time I sat down in a UP operating planning session regarding the UP-MPWP merger. And, first it was, as a kid who loved trains, being exposed to this kind of level of thinking and this level of expertise was quite a rush. But they took the planning for the merged system extremely seriously. They were deciding how they were going to run the railroad. And we would influence that to some extent by saying, look, you can have more public benefits if you do it this way, and that'll help us get approved. But it was a very sophisticated operation. If I may, let me talk about the Washington, D.C. perspective. So the Union Pacific proposed acquisition of Rock Island was the poster child for regulatory excess and ineffectiveness. It went on forever, and the railroad,
10 years, right?
The ICC's primary concern seemed to be, would anybody's feelings get hurt? And they wanted everybody to feel okay and do something for every railroad. Well, that couldn't happen, and in the end, Union Pacific wisely decided to let it go. In about the 1980 timeframe, there were some pieces of federal legislation that were passed that basically made it clear to the ICC, no, we expect you to decide these things and not worry about whether a railroad is adversely affected. We care about competition. So from roughly 1980 onward, the agency would say, we will be looking at the balance between public benefits, cost savings, which were often passed on to shippers, better service, single line service, so you avoid 113 different railroads commenting on your rate. I'm exaggerating, but it was a significant improvement versus the competitive harms that the merger would cause. Well, at Union Pacific, the policy essentially never stated was, we're going to solve the competitive harms first. And so we presented applications to the agency that already addressed competitive problems and also had significant public benefits. So we essentially had a case for approval right at the beginning. Now, the big battles that would go on for months and months and months were over whether our competitive fixes were good enough, and how do you define competition, and is reducing the number of carriers serving a particular plant from 3 to 2, is that a loss of competition or is it not? Those kinds of battles raged all the way through UPSP. But essentially, that's what we were focused on, is those benefits and those losses.
So if we look at the timeline, Project Manhattan sort of got the ball rolling. You talked some about it. Is there anything else you want to add before we move on to the Rock Island merger?
No.
So the Rock Island merger, which you talked about, as I recall, went for something like 10 years. And I don't remember the page count, but somebody calculated there were like 1 million pages of testimony or something like that for that. But do you want to talk a little bit about what was the notion behind the Rock Island approach to the Rock Island, and how was it going to fit in the operation, and why was it thought to be a good thing? And the condition of the company was vastly different at that when it began versus what it was at the end.
I worked for the Rock Island in the early to mid 60s, and my first year in the engineering department, I'll never forget this. One night we were in Atlantic, Iowa, in the roadmaster's office in the station. And he had this, what we called yellow clip, which was a telex message on his desk. It was turned upside down. And he turns this thing over and he said, "This is what's coming." And what the message said was, we, the Rock Island, have initiated discussions with the Union Pacific about a merger, and expect you will see teams of Union Pacific people that are coming out to look at the railroad. The railroad at that time was in so-so shape. I mean, the Rock Island was always kind of a marginal Granger operation. But in the next 10-year period, there was significant deterioration of the railroad. When the decision finally came down after, I think it was 12 years that the ICC mulled it over, John Kennefick called me one day and he said, "I want you to take a look at the Rock Island as it exists today, and I want you to tell me what we should do. Should we go ahead and pursue the merger?" So I assembled a small team to analytically look at the various options involving the Rock Island. We were assisted by a major engineering effort that involved the chief engineers and their staffs that went out, the chief engineers and the staffs of all of the Union Pacific, the Southern Pacific, and the Rock Island. Of course, I should have mentioned that the original Rock Island plan was that the Southern Pacific would buy everything south of Kansas City, and the Union Pacific would take everything north of Kansas City. So these engineering teams went out, physically went over every inch of the railroad, and determined what had to be done to bring us up to acceptable operating standards for UP and SP. That was the primary input to our analysis. So we finally got that done, and Kennefick called me up one Saturday morning, and I went up to his office, and I had a huge sheet of white paper that I had laid out a decision tree. And it had something like 48 endpoints on it. I walked in and I laid that on his desk, which was, as you would expect, a large desk for a CEO of a company, and it was usually pretty clean. There was nothing on it. And I started talking about this thing, and I didn't get very far. And he took his little finger, pushed it off the desk, and it went off the desk just like that, went up into the air, back down, landed in the middle of the room. And you could always tell when he was getting upset, because the red would start coming up his neck, and you just see it going up to the top of his head. And when it got to the top of his head, he blew up. And when I was up there, and he looked at me and he said, I need to know if we should buy the Rock Island. I want one number. Do we or do we not buy the Rock Island? One number. So with that, I knew this meeting was over. I got up and picked up my decision tree, went back to my office, and
Somewhat chastened.
I tucked my tail between my legs. And he called me on Monday morning and said, come on up, let's talk about the Rock Island. It's like nothing ever happened. I went in, I gave him one number, and that was the end of the Rock Island merger. And the company decided that we were going to terminate the discussion.
Interesting story and a lesson in executive presentation.
He taught me in very few seconds how you communicate to a CEO. And that is something that stayed with me for the rest of my career with UP to good advantage.
Now, how old were you at that time, just for context?
I had just turned 30 years old and had been with the corporation and the railroad at that time for 4 years. There's a lot of responsibility. I will say, I think he knew in his mind that we couldn't do it.
Yeah.
But he wanted to have the evidence that he could take to the corporation and to the board that would withstand any scrutiny. And that's why we went through the analysis that we did.
Maybe it'd be a good time to just talk a little bit about the corporate structure, because there was Union Pacific Railroad, then the corporation was created to hold the railroad, and there was good reasons for that at the time.
The Union Pacific, up till 1969, the company was the Union Pacific Railroad Company. And the Union Pacific Railroad Company had a lot of non-railroad assets, much of which derived from the land grants when the railroad was originally built in the 1860s. And in those land grants were significant mineral resources, significant land. And because of the situation involving Penn Central, and the question started to be asked, should railroads be privately owned? And there was a lot of talk about nationalization of the industry. The Union Pacific Board was very concerned about that. And they decided, and this was one of the things that the consulting firm worked on, that my first job with UP was with that firm, that they had to split the resources out, the oil, the mineral resources, and the land, so that the railroad was basically a railroad operating company. And if there was nationalization, those non-railroad assets were protected. So that's why the corporation was set up in 1969. And it wasn't a large staff at the corporate level, but they grew. And as we acquired other companies in the 1970s to help us develop the non-railroad assets. For example, we acquired a refining company, we acquired a petroleum marketing company, and you had to fund those investments, not only purchasing the companies, but ongoing capital, because they were not generating enough capital to meet their needs.
1976, there's a thing called the Palm Springs Conference that related to the SP. Do you want to launch into that?
Yeah, Southern Pacific in the early to mid 70s was doing merger studies also, and had I knew from my counterpart at SP at the time that their preferred merger partner was Union Pacific. In 1975, I think it was, 75, 76, there was a recession, pretty severe recession, and railroad earnings went into the tank. And Ben Biagini of the Southern Pacific called John Kennefick one morning, and the conversation, very to the point, Biagini said, "What's your number?" So Kennefick told him what our number was. You couldn't do that today. You could at that time. And Kennefick said, "What's your number?" And Biagini said, "Such and such." And Kennefick said, "Is it red or black?" And Biagini says, "It's red." That led to a discussion where Biagini asked Kennefick directly if UP would be interested in either buying the Southern Pacific or selling the railroad to the Southern Pacific. And that resulted in an analytical effort that was conducted by the corporate office in New York and myself in Omaha to determine whether we really had any interest in the SP. And a lot of that focus was to look at the SP's business base. And that was very revealing because at that time, Southern Pacific's major commodity movements were on a downhill slope, particularly perishables out of California. You had owner-operator truckers making significant inroads. Pacific Northwest lumber and paper was starting to be heavily impacted by competition from Canada and Southern Pine in the U.S. The West Coast auto assembly plants, all of the major auto assembly, Ford, GM, and Chrysler, had plants on the West Coast, shipped auto parts out there. That was prime business for the railroads. And then the other was the copper business in Arizona, which was up and down, but at that point it was down. So Kennefick came to the conclusion, as only he could say directly, the bloom is off the rose of the SP, which was true. And they met in Palm Springs. I think it was because of Ben Biagini, I believe, had a home in Palm Springs. And we told the Southern Pacific in that meeting that we were not interested in merging with the SP. That led to some things that happened then later in the 1970s, one of which was a proposal to merge with Seaboard Coastline. Seaboard Coastline wasn't interested in it. But more significantly for Union Pacific, it led to the Southern Pacific's purchase of the so-called Tucumcari line or Golden State line from El Paso to Kansas City. And that reduced Southern Pacific's mileage on a move from Central or Northern California to Kansas City by about 400 miles. What that meant to UP was they were going to take more business away from us at the Ogden Gateway. And that led to some studies that we did later in what was known as XYZ to determine, okay, what are we going to do now that they're in Kansas City?
Okay, so why don't we just move right across into XYZ, because that followed close on the heels of this.
In 1975, Kennefick was talked to Barry Schaefer about initiating an effort to take a look at where we should be positioning ourselves in terms of potential acquisitions. Barry, of course, had this template that we developed in Manhattan on how we should go about it. And essentially, it involved setting up marketing teams that would look at the markets, not only the railroad commodity markets, but where was the growth occurring in the country as you looked forward. We had an operating team that looked at the operating condition of the various railroads and competitively what either of them could bring to Union Pacific, and a finance team that pulled the numbers together. That turned out to be a major, let me back up. There was also an outside consultant by the name of Dick Barber that was involved in that and was very, very helpful. Dick Barber had worked at DOT and was very familiar with how things like this would be looked upon in Washington. What came out of XYZ was 13 volumes. If you stacked them side by side, it would cover about this much of a shelf. And it was one of the most thorough studies that I've ever seen done within the railroad. But what was more important was the conclusions that came out of it, because historically, Union Pacific always said, we need to get into Chicago, which was the eastern extension of the Overland Route. What Project XYZ told us was the growth isn't east-west. The growth is going to be in the south and on the Gulf Coast. And we, Union Pacific, need to position ourselves to tap into that growth. That led to looking at the Missouri Pacific and looking at what was referred to as the rag bag, which was nothing negative intended about the other railroads, but it was a combination of the Frisco, the Katy, and the KCS that might give you the same access that Missouri Pacific did to the Gulf Coast and to the south. We determined it did not give us the same access, and we determined that instead of going east, which would involve the Chicago and Northwestern, we needed to go south, Missouri Pacific. And that's when the decision was made, if we're going to merge with anyone, the first merger is going to be with the Missouri Pacific. About that same time, because of the diversion over the Ogden Gateway by the Southern Pacific to their long haul, we were starting to ask, how do we protect our access to the Bay Area in Northern California? Western Pacific had been bought out by a conglomerate. It was Mickey Newman, I forget the name of it right now, but they were spun out about 6 months earlier from the conglomerate. And Mike Flannery, who was a friend of Kennefic's from the New York Central days, was interested in potentially selling the WP. So we decided, given what we see happening with the SP, and given that SP is, as we felt, the bloom was off the rose, we should also acquire the WP. And that's precisely what we did in late 1979.
So how involved were the legal teams in the strategy formulation? Because obviously there's legal consequences with the regulators and the public and so forth.
Well, I was a pot. Well, I think, Barry was, obviously. So, when I got involved, it was presented as, here's what we're going to do, now make it happen.
Yeah, Brooks, the primary focus, as I indicated earlier, was the marketing, finance, planning organizations, operating organizations. Once the decision was made, this is where we have to go, that's when the law department was jumped into the discussion. But as Paul pointed out, Barry was actually in charge of Project XYZ. I mean, he initiated it and stayed heavily involved in it. Let me comment one other thing about XYZ, because this says something about Kennefic. Kennefic was a history buff, amongst other things. And I believe Barry is the one that's said, we're going to call this Project XYZ. Kennefic comes in and he tells us, Project XYZ was a effort on the part of the French to funnel weapons to the revolutionaries in the Revolutionary War, and they were coming through Canada. And one of the revolutionaries who was most instrumental in this was a gentleman by the name of Elbridge T. Gerry, who, if you look at the Declaration of Independence, is one of the prominent signatures at the bottom. Well, it just so happened that on the Union Pacific Board was a gentleman by the name of Elbridge T. Gerry, who was the great-great-grandson of the Elbridge T. Gerry in what was known as the XYZ affair during the Revolutionary War. Only Kennefic would know that.
That's great.
But, I mean, we all thought this was fascinating.
Yeah. In the interview I did with Jim Hagan, while he was at the Southern Railway, he worked very hard, very diligently to put together a merger with the Missouri Pacific. And they were on the cusp of getting that deal done when in jumped John Riebensdorf from the merger team. So you might want to comment on how that unfolded, because it's sort of a, Hail Mary.
John Kennefic and Downing Jenks, who was the chairman of the Missouri Pacific Corporation, parent company of the railroad at that time, were good friends. And Kennefic would go on inspection trips on the MOPAC, and Jenks would come out here on inspection trips on the UP. And we found out in late '79 through Barry Schaefer's father-in-law, who was on the board of the Missouri Pacific Corporation, that they were talking to the Southern and were very close to a merger. And about that same time, Downing Jenks called Kennefic and said, look, if you want to do a merger with the Missouri Pacific, you better put an offer in, otherwise we're going to end up with the Southern. So Kennefic immediately shot off a letter to the corporation in New York, a letter which came to be known as the jig is up letter, because he actually used the term the jig is up, meaning the corporation and the railroad have got to make a decision, and the time is now. Over a matter of not more than a couple of weeks, Jenks came into New York, we negotiated an agreement, and announced we were merging with the Missouri Pacific. As my good friend Jim McClellan, who was my counterpart at Southern Railway at the time, never ceased to remind me, we blew up his deal at the 11th hour, 59th minute, which unfortunately was true. We did.
And they didn't respond, make a counteroffer?
No, they did not.
Do you know why?
No.
Be interesting. It's too bad we can't ask Jim that question, but it's interesting that you were able to scoop it in there.
One other thing that I might point out that is kind of a humorous aside in terms of Southern Pacific's reaction to our merger with the MOP and the WP. Kennefic, right after, or the day that we announced the Missouri Pacific merger, he called Ben Biagini at 6 a.m. Omaha time in the morning. And he did this because he knew Biagini would still be at home at 4 o'clock, of course, in San Francisco. And he told Biagini we were merging with the Missouri Pacific. And Biagini made the comment, this is the most traitorous act since Benedict Arnold tried to sell West Point to the British. And with that, he hung up on Kennefic. So 2 weeks later, Kennefic, when we announced the Western Pacific acquisition, again, he calls Ben at 6 o'clock Omaha time, 4 o'clock San Francisco time. And he says, Ben, I've got a little surprise for you. And Ben Biagini said, what's that, John? He said, we're merging with the Missouri Pacific. With the Western Pacific, I'm sorry. So that resulted in another
Hang up.
comment similar to the traitorous act of
Corporate treachery.
corporate treachery of the
Highest
highest order. That's what it was, yeah. But he didn't hang up that time. He, as Kennefic said, he cooled off, and that he just simply said, we're going to fight you as hard as we can to just defeat your mergers. And they did. They were really tough in the ICC proceeding. I know because during cross-examination, the SPs, I believe it was one of the SP lawyers, we got into constant fights, and the administrative law judge took us offline 5 times and
To
said,
admonish
you
you.
guys better figure out a way to do this. Finally, our lawyer, Stuart Stock from Covington and Burling, grabs me and he says, they've got you figured out. They know how to press your button, and that's exactly what they're doing. So he said, don't take the bait. And it worked out, but it was tough. It was the transcript was about that thick.
And how long did that go on?
Pardon?
How long did it go on?
Well, 2 years.
Yeah.
Your cross-examination, though?
No, not. Oh, you talk.
Well, both. First of all, how long were you being grilled?
Oh, it took all afternoon.
And then the proceeding went for 2 years? Interesting. All right.
Yeah, one of the things that the SP said about the merger was that we were trying to make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. And to talk about Barry Schaefer and his sense of humor, he actually had somebody get a sow's ear from the Omaha stockyards and have a taxidermist mount it. And so we had that as kind of a little symbol
Memento,
of what we
right.
were fighting, and we would use it sometimes in presentations.
That's great. Okay, so back to the Missouri Pacific merger. Interesting story. Last minute, grabbing the iron out of the fire and putting the two companies together. You had a couple of stories, I think, that are add local color to this that I wish you would regale us with.
Yeah, there are a couple of stories that I think give you a sense for the relationship that Kennefic had with Downing Jenks. When the eastbound hump was built at North Platte, Union Pacific built a large flyover to get the locomotives from the westbound yard to the diesel shop, which was on the eastbound yard side. And shortly after the yard opened, Kennefic took Downing Jenks on an inspection trip on the UP. They stopped at North Platte. And Jenks saw that and he said, oh, that's interesting because in Switzerland they have these all over and they call them sheep jumps. So Kennefic has a sign made to hang on this bridge, and that sign still is out there today, and it's in French. I don't speak French, but it's something like "A Poussin du Nord Platte," which it translated means the sheep jump at North Platte. And to this day, on the Union Pacific, they're not called flyovers, they're called sheep jumps. Thank you, Downing Jenks. On another inspection trip, Kennefic was on the Missouri Pacific, and Jenks was telling him that they have changed the numbering scheme on their locomotives so that all 3,000, for example, 3,000 horsepower locomotives would be in the 3000 series, And a lot of railroads did that. We did that to some extent on the UP. So not too many minutes later, they go by a train in a siding, and the lead locomotive on this train is number 1. So Kennebec looks at Jenks and he said, "Downing, is that a 1-horsepower locomotive?" Jenks went crazy.
And probably had it renumbered shortly there.
I'm sure it was probably before I got out of the siding.
So could you, if to the extent as you can, talk about the merger with Mopac? What legal challenges, if any, there were? What opposition came from any other carriers? What role Covington and Burling played in that?
I mean, quickly, what opposition came from other carriers? Name one that didn't oppose it.
Okay.
I mean, you know, it was widely opposed, but we just had to take them on one at a time. I mean, the Southern Pacific did get significant trackage rights, you know, from Kansas City to St. Louis, and we gave up some other things too. But yeah, we just took them on one at a time.
I think most of the issues pertain to, I guess, what I would call competitive issues, where it was either a customer that wanted service from somebody else, or where we were potentially going to be diverting business, for example, from the old Frisco. Was the big UP's, I think at that time was the UP's biggest connection in Kansas City before the BN Frisco merger took place. And yet they, of course, were going to lose business as a result of the Missouri Pacific merger. So they would come in and oppose the merger. So, but as I recall, it was either other railroads that were faced with a loss of business, or customers who felt that they were going to be disadvantaged by this merger. It's interesting that the name that got applied to this was mop-up.
Right.
That tells you what
yeah.
the concern was amongst other railroads. They truly believed that this was going to mop up the West.
So this has it's been a long time, and I'm not going to bet my children on my recollection being correct. But I think there were 2 innovations by Union Pacific in that proceeding. One was, I think, Union Pacific focused its analysis more on down at the shipper level. You know, it wasn't sort of big sky, which corridors do we operate in, but does that particular shipper in Weeping Water, Nebraska, lose competitive service or not? If they did, then something had to be done about it. If they didn't, we were willing to fight for the proceeding, proceeding without it. The other thing is, I think we invented, and I'm going to credit the UP team for this, because I don't think we at Covington were competent. We invented new ways, innovative ways of measuring public benefits. The one that comes to mind for me is the use of cars and locomotives. We figured out new and pretty interesting ways of calculating and running computer programs to show how you could save cars and locomotives. Our opponents screamed bloody murder about all this, but they never could penetrate it. They never could undermine it. The ICC in its decision said, yep, those are public benefits, and that methodology has been used in every subsequent merger case.
You managed to jump through a bunch of mergers and acquisitions in a fairly short amount of time, without really, other than the Rock Island case, without really having a major set of obstacles. And then along comes this atom bomb of CN wanting to merge with Burlington, or Burlington Northern. And then the game changes, right? So can we dive into that? Because that was a bit of a shockwave.
May I?
Go ahead.
let's start with the first meeting to discuss the BNSF-CN proposal. It's out here. The lawyers and the government affairs people, we're kind of scratching our heads because we're saying, gee, if you look at the way the ICC and the STB have approached mergers in the past, this one's not very objectionable, but we don't like it. But it's kind of hard to fight. Dick Davis was up at the head of the table, and he's as tall as he can. And he said, then how are you going to stop it? Got it. That's a CEO at work making a great decision right there. I learned something from that, and I understood what the assignment was. We had to stop it. So at Union Pacific, we took the lead in organizing all of the other big railroads in opposition to BNSF and CN. I think Rob Krebs said, open the Wall Street Journal one morning, and here's a full-page ad against our mergers. Yeah, we organized that. The Washington office did a spectacular job of creating opposition in Congress so that Krebs was getting the signals out of Congress that people didn't like this. And of course, he mentions that his biggest customer, UPS, came out against him. That's a big problem. But as we continued to work through the regulatory process, it suddenly came to us that we no longer have 100 Class I railroads. And so it no longer makes any sense to have a federal policy, which was in existence, that favors mergers of Class I railroads. We're now down to 7. So we should go to the Surface Transportation Board and say, hey, it's time to take a fresh look at this. Let's change the policy and make it adverse to Class I railroads, or at least to require something more of them. The STB said, yeah, that's exactly what we were thinking, and they declared a moratorium. BNSF-CN was dead, and then they revised the federal policy on Class I mergers exactly as we had recommended.
Paul, anything to add?
Well, I was gone.
Oh, you were, okay.
Yeah.
But I think what Mike has described brings up another point, and that is Union Pacific, when it came down to mergers or the regulatory proceeding, was always in the forefront and to some extent was leading the industry. And I attribute part of that to the fact, the continuity that this merger team showed over the 30-year period. I mean, when he's talking about BNSF and CN, that was in early 2000s. And the merger team had existed for 30 years. I mean, it was a well-oiled team at that point. So we were able to respond quickly, and we were able to, on industry, where it required industry cooperation, to lead the industry. And again, I think that's a part of, or a benefit of the continuity that's been shown with the merger team.
Still a little bit of the Manhattan Project at work. That what? A little bit of the Manhattan Project still works. UP moves.
Goes all the way back to it.
Okay, so let's launch into the Northwestern merger, or acquisition, I guess I should say.
Could I intrude and
Yeah.
just mention one that we might otherwise ignore? Because it was a small one, with the MKT acquisition.
Oh, right. Should cover
1988.
that. Right.
So we were having a meeting in Washington, D.C. at Covington. And UP had just recently played an instrumental role in blocking the Santa Fe Southern Pacific merger. Now, they made their own bet. They said really stupid things publicly. And they started painting their locomotives in red and yellow. And that was pretty stupid. That pissed off a lot of people.
Well, you saw the SPSF logo that stood for Shouldn't Paint So Fast?
Yes, and Arvid somehow got a picture taken by a rail fan of a switcher that had been painted SFSP before the merger was approved.
How about KCS1? You remember that?
Yep. So Arvid kept that SFSP locomotive up on his wall for the rest of his life, actually.
I think on the Katy merger, I'd like to make some comments on it. What drove the Katy merger was Union Pacific, particularly in Texas, operated on significant portions of our main route, Missouri Pacific's main routes in Texas, over trackage rights on the Katy. And the Katy was, under the agreement, was responsible for maintaining the track. The Katy did not have the cash flow to invest to keep that up to a mainline standard acceptable to UP. Now, we tried everything we could to remedy that problem, but couldn't do it. And finally got to the point where we said, we're just going to bite the bullet and merge with the Katy. I got called by Kennebec, and he said, I want you to go down to Dallas and meet with the Katy's representative, and let's start talking about what we can do to merge these two companies. So I went down there and I met with Harold Gastler, who at the time was the president of the Katy. And this is kind of funny. After we had our first meeting, Harold said, why don't I think we need to go by assumed names when we talk to each other. So he said, I'll be Mr. Murphy. And he said, you be Mr. Murphy too. So here I'm sitting in my office a week or so later, and my secretary walks in and says, Mr. Murphy from Texas is on the phone. And she's got this smile on her face like, I know what's going on here. But the Katy merger was pretty smooth in terms of getting it approved. But the interesting thing about the MKT merger, in my mind, is we paid for that merger through sale of excess real estate. And in effect, we got the railroad for nothing. It was a good deal.
And then right afterwards, we sold the Katy line out of Houston to Texas for the Katy Freeway and got all the money back. But the one little quick story I'll mention, it was Jim Dolan, who was in Washington. He said, there's no way we can get this merger approved after what we just did to SFSP. And as you said, we actually had very little trouble because we were able to show that the Katy wasn't going to survive.
Well, it was failing.
Wasn't going to make it.
Right.
So it's the failing company doctrine at work.
So back to the Northwestern then, and the ultimate access into Chicago.
Yeah, Northwestern was another merger where I think our hand was forced somewhat. We, from the time I came to UP, we were constantly looking at the Northwestern and put together innumerable proposals to the corporation to acquire the Northwestern. And for various reasons, they always were, well, not now, we don't want to do this right now. So what happened was in 1987, a group by the name of Japonica, which was an investment group in New York, put together an offer to buy the Northwestern. That by itself was not necessarily bad for us, although we would prefer to own the Northwestern ourselves. But what was bad about their proposal is they were going to break up the railroad. They wanted to sell it in pieces because they came to the conclusion, and probably were correct in their conclusion, as is the case in a lot of acquisitions, that the parts are worth more than the whole. And what really got our attention was they wanted to spin out the Wyoming coal line, which would put basically another railroad in place of the Northwestern negotiating. They'd have to negotiate for higher rates, higher divisions of the rates between UP and Northwestern. And that set off all kinds of alarm bells. So we started looking at how we could protect ourselves and apply pressure on Japonica. One of the things we did was we negotiated a purchase option on Iowa Interstate so that we had a fallback if all push came to shove to get into Chicago by exercising the option to buy the Iowa Interstate. But the other thing that we did, and this was another 11th hour deal, Northwestern went out and shopped the railroad, and a company by the name of Blackstone, which had just gone into business at that time, Steve Schwarzman and Pete Peterson, I think they came over from, I think it may have been Lehman Brothers, one of the other big investment firms in New York. And they were talking to the Northwestern about acquiring the CNNW in total. So we injected ourselves into that. And as Steve Schwarzman later on said, you blew up my deal at the 11th hour, or you injected yourself in this deal. Bottom line, we ended up buying 25, I think it was, % of the Northwestern. Plus we got some haulage rights to market certain highly competitive commodities like perishables and canned goods, I can remember specifically, where instead of negotiating a division rate on an interline basis, we got haulage over the Northwestern. So in the interim, we could market a direct product in competition with particularly BN and Santa Fe.
Clever.
Kind of interesting, too, that Blackstone's office was at 345 Park in New York, which was the old headquarters of Union Pacific Corporation. And in fact, the conference table was the same conference table.
It was, yeah.
Yeah.
In fact, one other thing I should point out, when Mike Walsh came to UP in 1986, he was talking with Jim Wolfe about UP acquiring Chicago.
And Jim Wolfe's running Northwestern at that time.
Jim Wolfe was the CEO of the Northwestern at that time. So they decided, let's get our people together and see what we can do. So I got tapped to go to Chicago to meet with the Northwestern, which was, we met at a private flight service at Midway Airport. And I flew in there, and I'm sitting at a conference table, and in comes Jerry Conlon, who was, I think at the time, pretty much the number 2 guy on the CNW. He was Wolfe's go-to problem solver. Jerry comes in, and he's got this mischievous smile on his face. And he sits down right in front of me, and he doesn't say anything. It looks at me with this mischievous smile, and I thought, what's going on here? Then I noticed his tie. His tie had $signs on it, which was the message that he wanted to send. You're not going to get this thing cheap. So anyway, we negotiated with Jerry, and we were, the difference, as I recall, was it was less than $5 a share, but it was enough that we couldn't swing the deal. And that's when later Japonica came in, and then ultimately Blackstone, which that was in 1989, I believe. And then they held on to the company until they sold out the rest of their interest to us in 1994, I believe it was, because it was approved in 95.
Correct.
Okay.
So that the 94-95 proceeding, if I may tell this story, gave rise to one of the strangest proceedings. We were told that the Southern Pacific, for reasons that I don't understand, maybe you do, decided that stopping this merger with CNW was a life or death proposition. And their law department was told, either you stop it or you look for other jobs. So they came up with every conceivable way of fighting this deal. One of their attacks was to say that on the multiple segments of railroad where Union Pacific owned the railroad and handled the dispatching, but SP was running trains, that we were discriminating against their trains and making it impossible for them to compete with us. That's a pretty serious allegation, so we took it extremely seriously. We fought for months in the trenches over this. We had depositions at the Harriman Center, and it was pretty clear once we dug into it deeply enough that their experts were absolute idiots and did not know what they were talking about. This was going to go nowhere. But then a remarkable little incident occurred. The son of one of the members of this core group, Dale Saltzman's son, was a train fan. He's out in the middle of Illinois next to the Southern Pacific taking pictures of trains. A Southern Pacific train roars by. Somebody throws out of the window of the locomotive a brown package that lands at his feet. He opens it up, and inside is a very polished, very large, very extensive analysis by Southern Pacific management of how its trains are handled by various dispatching offices. And lo and behold, it shows that our people at the Harriman Center did better for them than their own dispatching offices. End of case. It's all over. They, of course, went crazy. There were fights about who had done this and how it happened, but the battle was over. We never, ever, clearly an inside job, but we have no idea how that happened.
And how he picked the right guy to throw the package to.
Somebody knew. Somebody knew he was there,
know, right?
And somebody knew what the legal fight was.
Right guy at the right place
At the right time. So maybe I can just tick through some things that you looked at and didn't do. The Rio Grande, Conrail, KCS, Illinois Central. Those are things that were on the radar and then removed from the scope.
Yeah, what happened in the late 80s, when Drew Lewis came to Union Pacific and became chairman of the corporation. Drew, as you probably know, was former Secretary of Transportation. He's the person that fired the air traffic controllers in 1981. And he was very well connected politically in Washington. And you had, at that time, various railroads that wanted to sell out. As I recall, the first one was the Illinois Central. This was before, what's the guy that headed up the Mid-South ultimately? I can't think of his name. He later went on to become president of the Southern Pacific. But the owners of the Illinois Central approached Drew about, would UP be interested in acquiring the IC? So I got asked to look at that, and we just didn't feel there was the benefit or that the competitive issue, because there was some parallel nature between the two railroads from Chicago to New Orleans in that corridor, and particularly in the Chemical Coast between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. So we turned that down. And then the next one that came in was KCS. And they wanted to sell also. And we looked at that, and again, the competitive issues, particularly in the Gulf Coast area, where we just didn't feel it was worth the risk with the Missouri Pacific. Conrail, that's an interesting one, because at that time, Elizabeth Dole, who was Secretary of Transportation, wanted to sell Conrail. And Norfolk Southern was interested in buying Conrail. And Drew, I'll never forget, he said to us, if we want Conrail, I can get it done. He was convinced he could swing that politically in Washington. We, at that time, were looking at Conrail from a Conrail perspective. And one of the things that we learned, which I think surprised all of us, was that it isn't the east-west business that's driving Conrail, it's the north-south business. And what made more sense from Conrail's perspective was a merger with one of the two systems in the south, which ultimately that's what happened. But we looked at all of these railroads and decided to pass.
In the Rio Grande?
Well, the DNRGW, that happened, that was a follow-on to discussions with Acadie. And at that time, that was when, that was pre-Phil Anschutz. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, when we decided not to merge with the Rio Grande, that's when the Rio Grande sold themselves to Phil Anschutz. Our concern was that if we acquired the Rio Grande, we would control both routes in the Central Corridor, which would open ourselves up to, at that time, we were concerned about BN. Because BN was one of the big drivers of Rio Grande's business at Denver that was going Salt Lake and mostly SP out of Salt Lake. So again, we decided we would pass on that. Although ultimately we did acquire the Rio Grande through the Southern Pacific.
Right. Yeah. Through the back door.
And we gave a lot of trackage rights up to do that.
So talk about Project Lincoln.
Lincoln was more a detailed analysis of CNNW. That the name came from me, and it had nothing to do with necessarily Abe Lincoln. It had everything to do with that was my hometown. So I just said, okay, let's call this Project Lincoln. Again, that was one of the many efforts to look at the Northwestern. And ultimately we did, out of that project, made another proposal to acquire the Northwestern, which the corporation declined on.
So moving on, one of the first hostile takeover events occurs when you look at the Santa Fe, and that's a pretty interesting story that we should spend some time on. We're 1994.
In 1994, the summer of 1994, I went to Dick and said, I believe that the Western rail system is going to collapse to two systems. And there's 4 players out there today, and I think it's going to go down to 2. And in my opinion, that we should couple up with the Santa Fe as opposed to the Southern Pacific. Burlington Northern at that time was looking at the SP also. And as I later found out, came to the same conclusion that we did, that the Southern Pacific condition, physical condition, had deteriorated so greatly that they were worried about the cost to bring the railroad back up to an acceptable level. So I asked Dick, I said, have established a pretty good working relationship with Santa Fe's Vice President of Operations. We're going to be having a meeting in Chicago very soon with the operating people of the Santa Fe. Would you mind if I kind of felt him out about whether they would be interested in a merger with UP? And Dick said, no, go ahead. So we had our meeting in Chicago, and the person I was going to talk to was not in the meeting, which I thought was strange. But after we had finished our meeting with the Santa Fe people, we went back out, and we flew in on the company plane and had a limousine to pick us up and take us to Santa Fe headquarters. Well, there were 4 big black limousines sitting out in front of the Santa Fe headquarters. So we asked the driver, no, we're not UP. And none of them were UP. And then finally another limo came up, and that was ours. But the next day, at, never forget this, 7:30 in the morning, one of my employees called me and said, do you know that Burlington Northern and Santa Fe just announced their merging? No, I did not know that. Well, as it turned out, as I found out later, the Santa Fe board was meeting 1 floor above us in their Schaumburg office, and they were voting on the merger with the Burlington Northern. And that's where the Santa Fe's vice president of operations was. That's why I did not get a chance to talk to him. So after, they've announced their merger, and we had extensive discussions with the corporation about what we should do about it. And it was White Matthews, the chief financial officer of the corporation, that initially suggested that we should do a hostile takeover, or make a counter offer for the Santa Fe, which we did. And I don't know if you want to go into the story about what happened in Chicago when they made the offer, but
No, I think we do.
Dick and Drew Lewis went to Chicago when we let the Santa Fe know that we were going to make a counter offer. Drew called Rob Krebs and said, I'm going to be in Chicago in 2 hours. I want to meet with you. Rob wisely immediately called his outside counsel. I think it was a fellow by the name of Bob Hellman, who was with Mayer, Brown, and Platt, I believe it is the name of the firm in Chicago. And when Drew and Dick met and went to Rob's office and put the offer on the table, but what was apparent to Rob at the time was that Drew had been drinking, and it was apparent. So the offer was put on the table. Santa Fe initially, I believe, rejected the offers, I recall, but then ultimately agreed to put both offers in front of their shareholders. And that resulted in some going back and forth between us and Burlington Northern. And it culminated in, as I recall, mid-December when BN put an offer that was slightly above what we considered to be our cutoff. And we didn't immediately put another offer in because then we had the Christmas holiday that was intervening. So I became convinced at that point that we probably wouldn't go higher, knowing that that was a little higher than our maximum threshold that we had calculated. So Dale Salzman and I, assisted by Dick Peterson, locked ourselves up in a conference room on the 12th floor at the old headquarters building over the Christmas holiday, and we took a really in-depth look at the Southern Pacific to determine whether we could competitively acquire the SP and still make it viable from an economic perspective, given all of the access that we're going to have to be giving up, particularly along the Gulf Coast and in the Central Corridor with the acquisition of the Rio Grande. To make a long story short, we came to the conclusion that we could get it done. And then that led to some discussions to convince the corporation, and actually on my part, to convince Dick Davidson that we should acquire the SP because Dick didn't want to do it. Again, he was concerned about the condition and what it was going to cost to put it back into shape. But it was shortly after the first of the year then that we called Santa Fe and said, we're pulling our offer off the table. And at that point, they went ahead with their merger.
So you really didn't have a lot of choice about acquiring the SP. It was really a strategic imperative almost.
When I went up to Dick's office, it was in about mid-January, and I said, we need to acquire the SP. And he said, I don't want to acquire the SP. And we got into this discussion about the condition. And just went back and forth. I finally just got to the point and said, Dick, if we do not acquire the SP, they're going to eat us alive because they're going to have a much stronger network. And the underlying objective at every one of our mergers was to make sure that we had the premier network and the premier franchise in all of the given corridors and overall as a network. We couldn't do that without the SP. So it was in my opinion, it was a no-brainer, but it was a matter of convincing Dick. And then we had to go to New York. Dick and I got on the plane, flew to New York to convince the corporation because they were not excited about it either.
But you were obviously able to do that.
We were able to.
Was it an uphill battle or was it fairly straightforward?
No, we were able to convince them in one meeting. It wasn't something that dragged out, and they got behind it. They got, as Paul has said before, they were 100% behind it once the decision was made that we're going to go after the SP.
Any commentary from the legal side of the house on the SP situation?
And we're going to buy the SP, okay? So let's get going on putting the merger application together and dealing with the competitive issues.
One of the things that Mike was talking about, some of the innovations that UP came up with in terms of the regulatory process. One of the things that came out of the SP merger that we did, which ultimately was followed by Norfolk Southern and CSX in their acquisition of Conrail. We identified all of the competitive locations, all of the competitive corridors where we were going to go from 2 to 1, because that was the hot button for the STB. And I put this together on a list. It was a little over a page long, about a page and a half. And we called Rob Krebs, and we decided that we were going to talk to various railroads about a package deal where we would provide these trackage rights or this access to specific industries, and that would address the totality of the competitive issues. In other words, we're going to go in as a part of our applications with a package that addresses every one of the competitive concerns. And we're not going to ask the STB in that case to figure out how do we ameliorate a competitive issue. So I got sent to Chicago to negotiate with Carl Ice. And we also talked to the KCS, and Montana Rail Link was the other one. They came in with they wanted to buy the Central Corridor. Our preference, I think, would have been KCS at the start, and simply because we probably thought KCS with their network would be a less competitive network. But what happened was we were offering trackage rights, for example, over the Cotton Belt from Texas to St. Louis. That was a 2 to 1 corridor. And there were Houston to New Orleans was another 2 to 1 corridor, and competitive access to the chemical plants along the Gulf Coast, where UP and SP were the only ones.
So when you say 2 to 1 corridor, you mean, explain that.
Where, let's take Texas to St. Louis as an example. The Missouri Pacific had their route from Houston to St. Louis. The Cotton Belt Southern Pacific also had a direct route between Houston and St. Louis. There was no other competitor, rail competitor, in that market. So by merging UP and Cotton Belt with Southern Pacific, you went from 2 competitive carriers to 1. So we were offering trackage rights because we didn't want to sell the railroad, in that case, the Cotton Belt line. And KCS came in, and instead of focusing on what we had on the table to address the competition, they went far beyond that. They didn't want trackage rights, they wanted outright purchase. They wanted to purchase the so-called OKT, which was the former Rock Island line between Harrington, Kansas and Fort Worth. Had nothing to do with acquiring ESP. As I told Mike Haverty, you guys overreached, significantly overreached. So we couldn't get a deal done with the KCS, which put more emphasis on getting a deal done with the Santa Fe. We were about a week away from getting a deal finalized with Santa Fe when Jim Hagan calls up. And Jim wants to meet in Chicago with us to talk about Conrail interested in acquiring parts of the Southern Pacific. You know, we couldn't figure out what is going on here. So we went to Chicago, we met with them, and the outcome of that meeting was that I was charged now with negotiating with Conrail at the same time that I almost had a deal done with the Santa Fe. And I thought, this is putting me in a pretty bad position. If Conrail ever finds out, which they did, that we were basically had a deal with the Santa Fe. What Conrail wanted was to buy all of the SP lines east of El Paso, which their primary interest was Gulf Coast Chemicals up to St. Louis. And I couldn't figure out why they wanted to do this. I later found out that what was going on was David Levan, who had succeeded Hagan at that point, was not convinced that Conrail had a future with its present franchise, that they had no place to grow. I personally disagreed with that, but that was the way they were looking at the world, and they wanted to acquire the Cotton Belt and the SP lines east of El Paso because they saw that would give them tremendous growth. So,
But that went nowhere.
that went nowhere, and ultimately what we did was we negotiated a deal with Santa Fe that gave them roughly 4,000 miles of trackage rights over the Union Pacific. And I was roundly criticized by some people at the time in Union Pacific that I gave away the franchise. The problem with that was you would say to them, okay, so we don't do this, how do we get this merger approved? Because you're not going to get this merger approved without addressing the competitive issues. To this day, there's people in this building that utter the statement that I gave away the franchise. And again, when they're challenged, well, how would you get the SP merger approved? It's the deer in the headlight look. Total silence. But as Mike and Paul could point out, there's no way we'd have got that merger done without addressing the competitive issues right up front. It was so complicated. I mean, I don't think we'd have got that deal done in 12 months. I think that even though statutorily they had to rule on the merger in 12 months, the competitive issues were so great that I think it would go
even into the years when I was general counsel here, I and my counterpart at BNSF set up a formal procedure to resolve additional disputes that kept coming up about particular industries or particular tracks. There were just so many things that no one could have foreseen that came up in later years. So, as you say, extremely complicated.
And I would say that even with the issue that John just described, we still had buy-in to do the deal, so we were able to get it done. But we did have to fight a few things. One of the things we fought was the desire by some in the company to go out and begin kind of running the SB before the merger took place. And we had to really put my foot down on that one.
Paul's made the statement before about how the other railroads got behind the merger. Southern Pacific, despite the fact that UP and SP historically have been like that, Southern Pacific, to a man, got behind this merger.
Well, it was probably survival, right? I mean, Southern Pacific
The people that knew that was what was going on knew that.
Yeah.
But like John Gray, this is the John T. Gray,
AAR John Gray.
He was involved in the negotiations with Santa Fe, came in toward the end. And Mike Ongerth, who was, I believe, Vice President of Strategic Planning at the time, Mike worked with Brad King, hand in glove, to put the operating plan together.
Yeah, and that's an interesting saga about the things that happened. And maybe we could spend a little time on that, because I know my involvement was peripheral because one of my clients was in the chemical business in the Gulf, and there were a lot of problems, obviously, down there with operational issues. Maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the things you were facing in trying to integrate the company and get the thing operating smoothly.
Well,
I lived it because I was sort of the reporter to the agencies in Washington about what was happening, why, what we were doing about it. And you talked to Dick about this, and his discussion is quite accurate. With any railroad merger, you have a conflict that has to be worked out. You want to proceed with implementation as soon as you can. That's how you get to your cost reductions, which then can be passed on to shippers in the old days. And you want to get your labor agreements in place. You want all that to happen. But every one of those steps, changing what labor does, changing the train plan, changing what the railroad yards do in blocking traffic, and very importantly, integrating technical systems, information systems, is disruptive. So in this case, add on to that the transaction itself, putting UP and SP together, especially on the Gulf, is as complex as anything since Penn Central. And then add to that the fact that SP has inadequate crews, they don't have enough resources, they have inadequate management because they'd run off a lot of their managers, they don't have a modern technical system, using one that I used when I was an employee out there, and a lot of their tracks are in terrible condition. So the question that UP management had to decide was, do we march ahead and do this, knowing there will be disruption, and get to the other side, or should we wait and upgrade the SP to some extent? I think the decision that Dick said, maybe we should have waited, but we didn't.
And looking back at it, if there's one decision that, at least in my mind, triggered this whole chain of dominoes to start falling, it was when we tried to close Strang Yard and put everything into Englewood. And as Mike said, the SP network was pretty fragile. I'm not sure we understood how fragile, but trying to put Strang, which was a hump yard, into Englewood, which also was a hump yard, and then trying to put some of the E&P business into Englewood, you soon had a situation like I think Rob Krebs has talked to you about in 1979, where it was gridlock. Houston was total gridlock. And the UP typical way of handling gridlock is to flood it with resources. That didn't do any good.
Certainly depleted
Because all you
resources from
had
the rest
was
of the
more
system.
locomotives on more trains sitting on sidings outside of the terminal. Plus you're burning up all your crew base. And this just was like a snowball that
And they-
ultimately affected the entire network.
The Strang modification, I haven't been able to nail this down to the precise day, and days mattered, but it was very, very close to the time when BNSF started performing maintenance on their line to New Orleans, which just shut UP down. And as one of their senior officials has told me, and said I can even quote him, there was no way you could operate Inglewood Yard with that loss of capacity. Even that is not quite complex enough because UP itself was doing track work on the same line at the same time. Probably shouldn't have done that. But in any event, it was virtually impossible to run Inglewood and get to and from New Orleans.
So did you reopen Strang? I don't remember.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, but there's a little debate about how much traffic got actually returned there. I don't know the answer to that. John probably does.
One of the questions I meant to ask and didn't before was there was an option you had to buy Iowa Interstate, but I don't have any more information on that. Obviously, you didn't do that. Was there a reason that you, A, obtained the option and then B, didn't exercise it?
One of the things we wanted to do was put pressure on if Japonica or someone else would acquire the Northwestern. We had a large book of business that was moving over the Northwestern. And if we had a alternate route into Chicago, it was kind of like the Rock Island merger. The UP was the 900-pound gorilla in terms of funneling business into Omaha. Well, by that time, when we acquired the option on the Iowa Interstate, it was essentially down to Burlington Northern, which was a competitor, or Illinois Central Gulf, then known as Illinois Central. And Illinois Central was not a viable option. Iowa Interstate, it's debatable how effective that would have been, but at least it gave us a threat that we could use in negotiations with any other party that might acquire the Northwestern, like Japonica or Blackstone. We ultimately sold that option back about after we acquired the Northwestern,
Who did you sell it to?
the Iowa Interstate.
Go back to them.
Yeah.
Earlier, we talked about the changes in the STB approach and requirements for mergers. And there's been a lot of discussion in the industry and outside the industry of will there ever be a transcontinental railroad? I think the way the STB has now configured the way they look at mergers, it'd be very difficult to envision that. And I think that was sort of part of the purpose in making that change. Could you just spend a little bit of time talking about
Well, I like John's description that he used with me, that basically the entire industry except BNSF and CN took a poison pill so that we couldn't do it. We had stop us from doing this.
save us from ourselves?
I would have thought, personally, there was still a chance, even under the new competitive rules. I think I know how I would make that argument. But what the STB did in rejecting CN's pursuit of KCS, but allowing CPs to go forward, I think sent a real clear message that they don't want to do anything that might destabilize the two systems in the East and the West, and they thought that CN KCS might do that. So I think you're probably right. It would be very difficult.
Now, having said that, I spent, or have spent, too many hours of my life looking at transcontinental mergers. But I agree with Mike, whether you think a transcontinental merger would be beneficial or not, I don't know that that's the question. The question is, could you ever get it done under the existing regulatory scheme? And I agree with Mike completely. The industry created a poison pill for itself. Now, you may want to say, then why were they successful in acquiring KCS? The reason they were successful is when the STB changed the rules back in 2000, there was an exemption that was carved out for KCS. I can only assume that it was at the request of Mike Haverty, that said KCS will come, anybody that acquires KCS will come under the old regulatory scheme, which was nowhere near as difficult as it is right now.
So those are all of the questions I have relative to the merger team, and would like to move into some form of summary. And the first question in that regard is, are there things that any of you would have done differently, or any actions you would have taken that might have gone in a different direction with the benefit of hindsight?
Well, the first thing I'd do differently is I'd never take a decision tree with 24 endpoints into John Kenefick's office. Lesson learned that time. But there are a couple of things that I wish we would have looked more closely at, and in one case, perhaps been more aggressive in our bidding. And the first one, I want to preface my comments by saying I understand that economically this could never be justified, okay? And that is the Milwaukee Pacific Coast Extension. If you look at our network today, there's the only place there's a gap. There's nothing in the Northern Corridor. Now, you might say, well, you do compete, and we do, between the Pacific Northwest and the Eastern gateways, but the Milwaukee could have provided access. It would have required some build-outs, but could have provided access to a lot of business that now is essentially captive to BN Santa Fe. Now, having said that, I want to stress, I knew how bad that railroad was because we again did a very detailed engineering evaluation. And the railroad basically had to be rebuilt from the ground up. And you could never justify it. But again, looking at it strategically and in terms of having a totally competitive network, I wish we had that today. But I know I couldn't justify it at the time.
If I could add a regulatory perspective to that I've never even seen discussed. When way back when Northern Pacific and Great Northern combined, the Milwaukee got competitive concessions to serve certain industries, certain places, some corridors. I think that's when they got rights to Portland, wasn't it? To my knowledge, the failure of the Milwaukee and the failure by the regulators to step in and say, hey, wait, we have to replace this, is the only failure by the ICC and the STB over this entire period to maintain competition when railroads merge. And I view that as a significant regulatory failure. It makes it impossible for me to say, oh, but competition has always been protected, because it hasn't.
I have a hard time seeing that in today's regulatory environment, with the STB rules being what they are, that they could ever approve a merger like BN's merger in 1970 under the current rules without some
a corridor solution,
strong competition in the North.
That's right.
But, that's past. It's a a regret on my part for whatever that's worth. The other one that I wish we'd have been more aggressive in bidding on was when Illinois Central sold off the Mid-South, what became known as the Mid-South, which is the Shreveport to Meridian line. And we put in a joint bid with Norfolk Southern. And as I recall, it was like $150 million. Now keep in mind, this is in the early 80s. And I think the railroad went for $300 million. And then when Mid-South sold out to KCS, or when Mike Haverty bought it, I think Mike paid $600 million for it. But that would have been, and it is right now, a strategic route for UP. We have a haulage agreement with KCS on certain business that moves over that line. But that is one strategic move that I wish we would have been much more aggressive on.
Paul, do you have anything you want to add into the what I would have done differently, or things I might have thought about differently?
No, I don't think so. I think we did a pretty good job.
Yeah, well, I think so too. So
I'll just ask a question, and then for John. Once you really took a hard look at the SP, and now we're in the mid-90s, decided that we had to go ahead and do it. Do you think there was an earlier point when the SP was in better shape where a harder look might have caused UP to move earlier?
With the SP?
Yeah.
It's interesting that you should ask that, because we did. I wish Dick Peterson was here, because he's the one that did this. As I recall, in the early 80s, that we took a look at the SP and decided that we probably should make an offer of some type for the SP. And Dick wrote a memo that Pat Barrett, who was the executive VP marketing sales at the time, sent to Kennebec. And essentially said to Kennebec, we think we should take a closer look at acquiring the SP. And Kennebec wrote back a note on this memo that said something to the extent of, if we have people that are spending time on things like this, we need to get rid of the jobs. Well, that's the end of that.
right.
So, and from a regulatory standpoint, I could make a thin argument, perhaps, that going after the SP when we did made it more likely that it would be approved. I mean, there's a lot of competition issues, and by mid-90s, we didn't make a failing company argument. The SP wouldn't let us do it, but we could have. We could have said this company is not going to survive. But I think everybody sort of knew that was probably the case. And as the STB almost said in the service crisis later, there's only one solution to the SP. Nobody could have saved it. Nobody. Not the government, not another railroad. Nobody but the UP.
Correct.
Only UP's resources could have saved it.
But on the other hand, I don't think, had we proposed a merger in the mid-90s, in the absence of a BN Santa Fe merger,
Hopeless.
yeah.
You had commented earlier you were on the hook to explain to Washington about the meltdown in the Gulf. How long did that go on, and how much of your time was consumed by that? Were you going to Washington? Were you,
Well, I lived there. I almost mentioned earlier that the service crisis was by far the most intense period of my legal career. It was taking all of our time. It was taking Saturdays. It was taking Sundays. We were receiving box loads of complaints, objections, government attacks on the merger throughout the period from roughly about July 1, 97 into the next summer, even though by April 1, 1998, the railroad was basically back in shape. So this was a year-long, very intense fight to save the merger.
Last question. What would you attribute the team's effectiveness to be in terms of getting things done? You didn't have a formal structure per se, you didn't have a formal leader, but you managed to function pretty effectively as a team. Can you just, each of you maybe comment on how that happened and why it happened?
You know, in my estimation, the first thing that made this successful was the people. And the skill sets and the knowledge of the industry that they brought to this. People like Dick Peterson and Dale Salzman in particular. I hesitate to use the term, but out of the 6 of us, 5 of us are rail fans. I put Paul in the category of not being necessarily a rail fan. But in some quarters, that's a derogatory term, to be a rail fan. It wasn't in this company. And one of the reasons it wasn't was the chief rail fan in this company was John Kennefick. And it wasn't discouraged. It wasn't looked down upon to like railroads. But we could, as a group, we could bring that together and look at the rail network and Union Pacific strategically. That had we not had the background of the interest on the part of the people, it probably wouldn't have happened. The other thing that I think was important was we had the support of management, but more importantly, we always had a direct communication link to the CEO. One of us always could pick up the phone and call Kennefick. It wasn't that you got to go through 3 or 4 levels to get something done. We could act quickly. The other point, though, that I would make, you know, you might say, well, why didn't the other railroads have a merger team? Between 1980 and 1995, Union Pacific did 5 mergers. BN did 1. Santa Fe did 1. I mean, you could ask the question, did they have the need for a merger team? And I guess I could argue that both ways, but they didn't have the type of need that we at Union Pacific had.
Well, we've covered it over and over and over again, but I think what made it effective was that we had, you know, total buy-in from the top, and and then, you know, as we moved through these deals, it made sense to have the same people working on them, but you would have a huge number of other people working on one deal or another. I mean, Covington, if you look at the letterheads then, I mean, he would, you know, Stuart Stock only worked on UP MOP as far as I know. But, you know, Mike was always there, Arvid was always there, but other people, and same thing in the law department. I mean, we had many, many people working on those deals. But I think it was you know, as John pointed out, we did 5 of them, and as a result, we had people who had worked on all 5, and it really worked.
A lot of experience.
You know, a comment that I think we should have made early on here with the merger team, this wasn't for the people that were on the team, the core team. We had a full-time job. And other than like for Paul in the regulatory arena where it could become all-consuming, we were working as a member of the merger team at the same time that we were doing our normal daily work. It wasn't that we got pulled off and you're assigned to a merger team and that's all you do. It wasn't that way.
It was clearly that way for me during UP MOP WP. But after that, because we had gotten better at doing it and more efficient, I was basically doing a lot of other stuff too.
Yeah.
And well, I'm sure I don't know. Did you have any other clients?
Oh, absolutely, I did. So I've already emphasized how encouraging the company and its people were to having outside counsel be integrated into the merger process. I had 3 major airlines as clients. I had every other Class 1 as a client at one point or another. I never experienced anything like it. It was expensive, I don't doubt that, but we were so committed that there were times when Arvid or I would take our own money, buy an airplane ticket, and go see something we needed to see for Union Pacific, because we were that involved, cared that much. It's a huge deal.
Very good. Thank you, gentlemen.
Let me make one final comment.
Sure.
You look at the wall here, Union Pacific Building America, and that's the company's logo, and I think it is appropriate. But I look back on this and, Abraham Lincoln chartered the Union Pacific, and you can say Abraham Lincoln was instrumental in building the Union Pacific. It was Thomas C. Durant that actually physically built the railroad, the original Transcontinental Railroad. E.H. Harriman came in and modernized the railroad and built the Union Pacific that we all knew up until about 1975. It was this merger team that, and I don't think it's necessarily a stretch to say, this is the team, the group of people that created and built the Union Pacific network and franchise that we know today. And, just speaking for myself, I take great personal pride in knowing that I was a part of that.
Very good. Well, on that note, we in the media biz say that's a wrap.
All right.
So thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you.